This is the Biz News Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
You might remember seeing them at various events around town, like a school board meeting back in the day. Or perhaps you remember smudging your fingers on the ink from the morning paper, reading what they wrote back in the day. The apex of that ancient time was only about 2 decades ago, when the local newspaper sent reporters to cover the meetings of school boards, town councils, the local concert band performance, or maybe a ribbon cutting at a new local business. According to the Pew Research Center, newspaper newsroom employment peaked in 2006, and then about 74,000 jobs. Today, that number has fallen to under 30,000, and it's still dropping. Trying to do something about it is the nonprofit organization Report for America, which places journalists in local newsrooms to report on undercovered issues and communities, paying half their first-year wages and a third of their pay in year 2. Heading that effort is Steve Waldman, a former newspaper journalist, who joins us for this Biz News interview podcast. Steve, you have talked quite a bit over the past several years about the increasing problem of a decline in local newsrooms, specifically newspapers. Newspapers failing, newspapers cutting down to the bare bones. Would you give our listeners and viewers a thumbnail sketch of what you are saying?
Yeah, we've seen in the last decade or so a massive, severe drop in local news and the capacity of local reporting in particular. There's 1,800 communities in America that have no local newspapers, about 22,000 newspapers that have closed. And perhaps most important, there's been a 57% drop in the number of reporters, of newsroom employees at newspapers. And that has only a slight fraction of that has been replaced by new digital operations. So you have this situation where you have more and more ghost newspapers, is a term of art these days, which is newspapers that are still operating, but have, very, very few reporters and increasingly are filled with, national wire service copy instead of local. There was one amazing study that said 17% of the articles in a local newspaper are about the local community. And the rest of it is national wire copy. And it's basically how a lot of newspapers have kept going, is they've cut the reporting staff, but kept the pages filled with stuff by, adding other content like that. So this is a real serious threat to democracy. This isn't just about, journalists not having jobs. They can get jobs somewhere else, but this is about communities not being well informed. And there's all sorts of evidence that is, backs up what I think we would know intuitively, which is that when you have a collapse on this scale of local news, it affects voter turnout goes down, corruption goes up, bond ratings go down, pollution goes up, people's engagement with the community lags, people's alienation from the community increases, polarization increases as a result. So it's having really severe consequences on democracy, or really the ability for people to choose their elected officials, hold people accountable, but also just, the ability of people to have information that they need about their schools or their hospitals or their police, to have, their community work. And then a softer harm that's a little, less precise, but also really important, is that communities don't know themselves as well. You have the communities are more polarized. Because as we know, the newspaper traditionally has played a function of connecting a community, whether it's obituaries or high school sports or, restaurant openings or things like that. It's not only about holding the mayor accountable, it's also about all sorts of other things. Now, Well, why don't I stop there, because I've laid out, a pretty depressing picture there.
That certainly is depressing, of course, but what about the local radio station, for example? Aren't they filling the gap?
Well, radio has also declined. Now, it hasn't declined as quickly as newspapers, but there's many communities don't have local radio that have reporters. In the communities that are fortunate enough to have that's helped. And same with TV. There are communities that have very strong local TV stations. TV reporting staffs have remained relatively stable. They've added a lot of hours, so those reporters are spread more thin, but it's remained more stable. But one of the things that everyone in the journalism world kind of knows but doesn't talk about as much is there's sort of an ecosystem with different players in the ecosystem playing different roles. And traditionally, it has been the newspapers were the one who did the sort of extractive reporting, accountability reporting, investigative beat reporting. Most TV stations don't have beats. They do general assignment for the most part. So, and then the TV stations would play a really, really important role of different sorts. They had certain things that they excel at. I mean, things, natural disasters and crises like that, as well as, the core elements of weather and sports and traffic and things like that. And, and the system kind of worked because the TV stations would amplify some of the reporting done by the newspapers and vice versa. But now you have this net drop in the number of reporters. That's why I keep coming back to the number of reporters, because in a way, it doesn't really matter whether this is done by a newspaper or someone else, or something new. Like, I'm not saying like we need to hold on to the same old models. Obviously, we're not, and we can't. But at the end of the day, you do need some critical mass of journalists in the community to do reporting.
Reporters, like everybody else, need to draw a paycheck. So what is the business model for the future that would provide for adequate reportage in any given local community?
Well, the traditional commercial model for newspapers was very heavily tilted toward advertising. And that's the part of the business model that has been most disrupted by the internet. Businesses feel like they don't have to advertise in the local newspaper. They have many other options, including Google and Facebook, Yelp, Amazon, many other things. So that's the core problem. Since 2000, there's been an 81% drop in newspaper revenue. So to give you a sense of just how, gutted the ad model has been. Now, it's not eliminated, but, that was the heart of the model, and it's not there anymore. So what everyone is, or mostly are feverishly working toward, is to say reader revenue, which was always there, but it was often a secondary element, needs to become the primary element. So subscriptions. And in the new world, that means not so much getting more people to buy the paper, but more people getting digital subscriptions. So the smart publications are working hard to increase their digital subscriptions. And that is going to be probably the number one determinant of whether enough businesses, commercial, local news organizations can, get to where they need to get. But it has to go beyond that. Most places are also looking at other ways of engaging the communities. Events is popular. And then the third part of it is that we really need a nonprofit local news sector too. And that can mean nonprofit news organizations, which there are now hundreds, that are filling many gaps left by the contraction of newspapers. It's still too small, but it's growing, and they're doing amazing work. Or there are hybrids where commercial entities are working with nonprofits to help fill in some of the gaps that they may have. For example, the program that I run, Report for America, is a nonprofit organization. We have 325 reporters in the field placed into local newsrooms. Half the newsrooms we place reporters in are for-profit newsrooms. And they're doing very public service oriented beats. But that's a kind of a collaboration that you wouldn't have seen 10 years ago between a for-profit newsroom and a nonprofit newsroom. Things like that are happening all over the place because desperation prompts creativity, and there's all sorts of new models that are being tried now.
Now, with 325 reporters essentially on your staff, you have one of the biggest newsrooms in the country.
That's true. They are employed, actually speaking, by the newsrooms themselves. So they are both part of our program and part of the newsrooms themselves. So we don't really have a singular newsroom of 325 people. We have a community of 325 reporters working, for these newsrooms. And that's important because we're not like trying to create a bureau system for a national publication. Our mission is to help those publications to help those communities. We want those reporters there working in the neighborhoods, helping those publications and TV stations and radio stations to succeed in better connecting with their community.
So just to make that clear, you are paying them, not the newspaper, radio station, or TV station.
It's a partnership. We pay half, and the newsroom pays half in the first year. And then in the second year, we pay a third, and the newsroom pays 2/3. Now, a really key element of what Report for America does is we work with those newsrooms to help them raise part of their portion from the community. So we're trying to help them to develop what I call the third revenue stream, which is philanthropy, development from the community, small donors, large donors, community foundations. And the goal is that, we make it so that if the reporter, if they don't have a Report for America person in 2 or 3 years, that they will have built up their revenue enough that they could maintain that position. That's our holy grail. And it's real, that part's going really well. The average Report for America newsroom has raised, I think it's $26,000 per reporter from their community last year. So there really is a growing sense in communities that local journalism is a civic responsibility on some level, and that's a new concept for everyone. Like, 10 years ago, this was a perfectly robust, healthy business, and everyone could just assume, local news, the local newspaper and the TV station, they've got that. And that's not true anymore. So we are increasingly communities, like community foundations and chambers of commerce and just health organizations are realizing that their ability to solve their own problems is now compromised by this problem that probably seemed remote and like someone else's problem for a while. The whole community is realizing it's their problem too.
So talking about the whole community realizing it's the problem, do you see that essentially it would have to be a grassroots movement across the country supporting their local journalists? Do you see that happening?
That's well put. And yes, we're seeing the beginnings of it. It's very early, but we are seeing the beginnings of it. We see it in the donations that we get to our local newsrooms are amazing. Some of them are small and you'll just get a check, but sometimes people walk into the newsroom with a check to a commercial newsroom that is not used to getting donations. They're used to getting subscriptions. Someone will come in with a check saying, I like what that reporter is doing. It's so important that they're covering, the environment in our community. Or we'll do, the newsrooms will do direct, email fundraising campaigns where they'll feature journalism done by the newsroom and really highlighting what they do. And so it has the secondary benefit, which is that the newsrooms are forced to explain to the community what they do and why it's important and what the reporters, what the reporters are actually up to, and humanizing those reporters and creating, hopefully, a stronger connection between the newsrooms and the people in the community, so that it's not just that big building up there with the logo of the newspaper that's this kind of forbidding institution. Newspapers are realizing that to survive, they're going to have to be perceived by their community as having their backs, as being there to serve them, they're a service industry in some ways, and that's not really the way journalists thought of ourselves. I remember when I first started in journalism, one of my editors said something like, never forget, journalism isn't a healing profession. And like on one level, I kind of understood that. We're not supposed to care. We're not supposed to worry about being liked. And we're not only supposed to make people feel good, right? Like sometimes we're supposed to make people feel uncomfortable, and we're supposed to make politicians squirm. But in another sense, it's not true. Like it is the case that journalism at the end of the day does have to be of service to the community. It has to be useful. And whether that's usefulness is on a, democracy level, like you got to hold power accountable and institutions accountable, or whether it's useful on a more practical level, like I don't know whether my school is actually teaching my kids, oh, I just read this article that tells me which schools are doing well and which aren't. One way or another, it has to be, be seen as actually useful to a community.
It is almost as if you are in the lifeboat, which has holes in its hull, and you're bailing like mad. Are you keeping ahead of the incoming water or not?
It's a good question. I think, in raw numbers, we're not. Like the decline is going faster than, the water's coming in faster than we're ladling it out. But in another sense, it's really exciting. I'm going to try to extend on the metaphor. I feel like there's some other boats that are starting to come around our little leaky dinghy, and they're cool. They look different, and they seem sleek and modern, and they don't seem to be leaking as much. And they're helping. They're both helping us ladle, and they're also showing us how, new ways to do this. So it is in some ways a really exciting, positive time, because there's more innovation going on in local news than there has been probably in decades. And you see it all over the place. Little hyper-local mom and pop websites that have popped up because there's nothing going on, or really creative nonprofit organizations that have said, oh my God, no one's covering the State House. We've got to cover the State House. This is insane. And they're 10 reporters are suddenly there covering the State House because of a nonprofit group, or for-profit entities that are doing really interesting, innovative things like partnerships with nonprofits, or doing beats. Like one of the things that's exciting that we have this wonderful perch on this through Report for America, because when the newsrooms apply to us to get one of these awesome reporters, they have to make a case to us why we should choose them. And part of the case that they make to us is we have a really important beat that needs doing. And a lot of these beats, they basically frankly say, this is an incredibly important beat, but we haven't been doing it because it hasn't been economical. Like maybe it's covering a lower income community where they sort of, no one would admit this out loud, but the reality is when you're making dollars and cents decisions, sometimes they don't cover the lower income communities because they figure there's not as much ad revenue there. Which, that's a debatable assumption, but that happens over and over again. Or there's some outlying county that they used to cover when they were flush, but then as they started to contract, they contracted down into the center, the center town. And then there's all these surrounding communities that are left without coverage. So the newsrooms apply to us saying, there's these huge holes in our coverage. No one's covering the schools in that county, or no one's covering the healthcare system in that county. And so it has gotten the newsrooms to think about it in that way and feel like they had a possible solution to fulfilling really important beats. And anecdotally, what we hear from them is that the community appreciates it. They whether it's through donations or subscription renewals, it turns out that doing good journalism actually matters, in the minds of the people in the community.
Steve, I'd like you to crank up that crystal ball you've got stored in the desk drawer there and tell us where you think this industry is going to be in 5 or 10 years.
I have my rose-tinted crystal ball and my, gray-tinted crystal ball. So I think we're at a crossroads. Like, we actually have to make a decision as a society right now, where if we don't do anything, if we kind of just assume somehow this is all going to take care of itself, or that it's not important, we're going to go down a very dark road where the local news system is going to continue to collapse. People are still going to be getting lots of information, but it's going to be national cable news. It's going to be social media. More of it's going to be misinformation. It's almost like we'll have a tribal press. Remember the historians of the newspaper industry talk about the very first period of American history being the partisan press, when newspapers were owned by political parties. We're headed toward the tribal press, where more and more local news organizations are part of political organizations or have ideological bent or things like that, or just don't exist, right? So that's the dark path. But we also can decide as a society that this is too important to do that, to allow that to happen. And if we do that, we can solve this. It's a solvable problem. And what has to happen is, first, the businesses have to continue to innovate and do, model improvements around getting people to be digital subscribers. Second, we absolutely do need a big increase in the philanthropic commitment to public service journalism in the local level. Like, there's a lot of money that goes to, nonprofit journalism. Not nearly enough of it goes to local nonprofit journalism. So that absolutely has to be a part of it, whether it's creating new nonprofit organizations or helping existing ones or partnering with the commercial folks around public service-oriented projects. The third thing, which may be more controversial, is I think public policy actually has to play a role. That some sort of government involvement. It has to be careful, but the scale of the collapse. Think about this: if you said the healthcare industry, we've lost 81% of our revenue in the last 2 decades. That would be something public policymakers would be, paying attention to. We've lost 57% of our work. Imagine if we turn on the news and said, new study reports that there are 57% fewer nurses in the country than there were 2 decades ago. Like, that would be a crisis, right? We would address. So now the problem is the First Amendment, which is not a problem. It's a good thing. But what I mean by that is there is an inherent problem with the government helping the media, right? So it has to be done wisely and well. And the government has, in fact, helped the media through all of American history. Like, they're, all the way back to, the Post Office Act that George Washington signed into law, which provided billions and billions of dollars of subsidies. So it has to be done well and wisely, and there are some ways to do it. But I think that's probably the third piece of the puzzle.
Sounds almost like the third rail. I know many journalists would say government is already trying to help, quote unquote, the media through their PR people. But can they be believed? And who checks on them if the government is helping?
Well, so that's why you actually have to have reporters. And there was a provision it was actually in the Build Back Better Act, and also exists as its own legislation, to provide a payroll tax credit to news organizations for hiring and retaining local journalists. It's like a very simple concept, but powerful. Like, it would have provided up to $25,000 per head in the first year and $15,000 in the subsequent years. It would have really changed the incentive structure in local news and would have helped staunch the bleeding and help grow back new models. There's another approach that is very clever at, I think, solving the issues of, well, the government shouldn't be deciding, who gets what, which is give a tax credit to small businesses that advertise in local media. Or, for that matter, give a tax credit to consumers that subscribe to local media. So there, the government's not deciding which news organization gets it, the advertiser is. The government's not deciding it, the consumer is. And I think that's really clever. It's a way of getting some, capital pumped into the industry but in a way that's still very market oriented. You still have to convince the consumer that you're worthy of a subscription. You still have to convince the business to, hey, advertise over here. So, it's not like a handout in the way that could create the, bad incentives. So I think there are ways of doing it.
Steve, where can our listeners and viewers get more information about you and your organization?
Reportforamerica.org is the website for Report for America. That's the national service program I was describing that places journalists into local newsrooms around the country. If you are interested in that public policy piece, we have created with 17 other national organizations something called the Rebuild Local News Coalition. And the website for that is rebuildlocalnews.org. And you can learn about the public policy side of it there.
You have been very generous with a lot of thoughts and certainly have stimulated, I'm sure, many a conversation among our listeners and viewers. But Steve, what would you like to add that we haven't talked about? Could be anything.
Well, just that, given your audience, I have been, we often talk about how inspired we are by the reporters that are going into the field. They are amazing, and they're going in, they're smart, and have skills that I wouldn't dream to have myself and didn't have, and they're public service oriented. But there's a lot of really inspiring people working in newsrooms, editors and publishers and other editors who are really, despite a lot of economic forces that are grinding them down, are really trying to do good work in their communities and serve their public. And I'm inspired by them as well. And I think what now has to happen is that the community, Americans, have to step up as well and realize that saving and rebuilding local news is the responsibility of the community, not just a single business. If we want communities news to survive, the community has to support it.
You've been watching the Biz News Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. Thanks for watching.